This is a really short article I wrote. I think we've got enough of those, so we'll go around. That covers this. Basically, I have a paragraph on each of these things, right? Now I know I've been talking for a long time, and now I just put up a slide that has 15 points, right? I know that's scary. We've already talked about almost all of these, right? I developed these key aspects. It used to be 10, then it got to 12, and now I'm at 15. It's kind of like my elevator speech about deliberation if it was a really tall building and a slow elevator. But there's kind of, again, some of the key concepts that we'll kind of go back to, right? So we've already been talking about tough choices and, dealing with tensions a lot. And in particular, balancing individual interests and the public good, like we talked about, is just a constant tension that we need quality conversation to deal with, right? Skip this stuff there. Public judgment is, the heart. This goes back to my rhetorical background in a sense, but in some ways, universities used to be more about developing good judgment and wisdom, and then they shifted to focus more on developing knowledge, right? But knowledge is a means to an end, right? We need knowledge to make better decisions. And most of the tough issues we're dealing with, we're not going to knowledge our way there, right? At some point, we may need to make tough decisions between things. We're always going to have uncertainty. We're always going to have incomplete information, right? So that's the public judgment thing. So this is kind of a graphic we'll keep on playing with that I found a few years ago. This is Sam Kaner's Facilitator Guide, really useful book if you're interested in facilitation. But he talks about with any kind of tough decision, we need to kind of go through at least 3 stages, right? So the first stage is we need divergent thinking. Here, we need open-mindedness, right? At the beginning of a process, we tend to be too closed-minded, right? We tend to have it already figured out, right? So most decisions, what happens is we don't have enough divergent opinion. We jump to a decision point, so we have false consensus. We think we all agree because we didn't let anyone disagree in the room. Or we didn't let them speak if they're in the room. Or if they spoke, we kind of shut them down pretty quickly, right? You've all been in a committee meeting, right? Where everyone seems to agree, but then someone kind of says, well, yeah, but, all right, because now the meeting's longer, right? So there's a lot of kind of inherent kind of pushback against dissent, against, complicating things, right? So one thing, better process. We need better processes to allow for divergent opinion, right? To help people think outside of the box. To work harder at convening to get people that disagree in the room, right? So to avoid false consensus, we need kind of how do we get more voices in the room? How to do that? We can do that in lots of ways. We can do that with surveys. We can do that individual opinion. We can do that if we search for it, right? If I'm an activist that wants people to follow my perspective, I want a very narrow range of opinions, right? I just want the people that agree with me talking, right? If I'm a deliberative practitioner that wants to consider all opinions and I care about democracy, I'm going to broaden the conversation. The problem is success kind of leads to problems here. If we do a really good job of divergent thinking, now we have lots of voices in the room, and it's messy, right? And so I think the problem we run into a lot more is we allow lots of different voices, and then we jump to a decision, right? So city council is dealing with a tough issue. They have public comment. We have 100 people at the microphone. They all speak their truth, right? And then city council makes the decision, right? And we allowed everyone to speak. No one was listening. No one worked through the issue. No one understood each other, right? So if I went to city council to tell them how horrible this idea is, and I got to speak my truth, and then 20 minutes later they vote for the idea, I'm thinking, what the heck? Didn't they hear me about how bad it is? Right? The city council is trying to balance kind of all these things in a way, right? So I think we have such a free speech tradition, especially in the United States, that there's lots. We have some work to do, right? Certainly the dominant voices, and but the problem isn't so much getting chances to speak. The problem is making sense of all that noise, right? And too often we have all the voices and then we jump to the decision, and that creates this polarization and frustration, right? So the middle part of working through the groan zone, and I love when I'm training facilitators about having that term, the groan zone, right? Because I can tell them that if your table is struggling, it means it's working, right? Because they should struggle. These are tough issues. Right? And when people take the blinders off and they get away from the simplistic framing and they're now dealing with underlying tensions, it's going to be hard for them, right? But in the groan zone in particular, while there's lots of ways of doing divergent thinking, there's lots of ways of collecting opinion, right? The groan zone, for me, takes small groups, right? We need to have a real conversation. We need to be in a circle and talk about it, right? That takes interaction. That takes real kind of human, genuine communication. The problem is communities don't have that capacity, right? We have so much capacity, so many ways to give people a chance to speak their truth, right? We have very few ways for people to actually have a real conversation with other people and work through that, right? So that's the work that the CBD is doing. The work that we can be doing in our classrooms is start giving students the skills to do that in a way, right? But then the back end, the next problem that happens, so if we get past false consensus, we get past false polarization, right? Then we get stuck with paralysis by analysis. Goes back to a simplistic good versus evil framing. It's easy to move to action. Let's just get rid of the evil, right? Once it's more complicated, once you realize people that you disagree with are coming from good, probably not as good as your place, but coming from a good place, right? It's harder to make a decision, right? You've complicated things, and you get stuck there, right? A lot of our deliberative processes, we really change the conversation. People realize, yes, this is, got to see this from multiple angles, but then how do you move that decision? Or the same thing, so many people in our field glorify open-mindedness so much, which is great for divergent thinking, which is great for creating understanding and kind of talking about this, but then if we actually need to make a decision, right, then it gets harder, right? And there's so much focus now from the dialogue people of saying, one thing I specifically pushed back on, we did this activity at the NCDD conference, and one of the cards that we had about dialogue and deliberation was that, deliberation is all about the recognition that everyone's opinion is equally valid. I can't go there, right? I can go that everyone's opinion has validity, everyone's opinion has value. We should listen to everybody, right? But clearly some people's opinions are better than others. It's based on more experience and more data or a better mix of evidence. The simple thing is, we do some work on immigration issues, those type of things. I'm not going to seek out white supremacists to make sure they're in the room, right? I feel pretty comfortable that the white supremacist opinion is less valid than others, right? I'm going to draw that line somewhere in a way, right? So for convergent thinking, to make a decision, we need to start prioritizing. Some values are going to be more important than others for the community, right? So it's not that closed-mindedness is bad, right? It's arbitrary closed-mindedness is bad, right? We need to figure out better ways of making decisions and struggle with that. But there's not a set, expert way to make this decision of what's more important between these values. It's always going to be a constant struggle, right? So this becomes process-wise, what our communities, what our organizations need. We need better processes for divergent thinking. How do we make sure we get lots of voices in the room, right? We need devil's advocates and those type of things, right? And then how do we need better processes for working through the grown zone, right? As a term, kind of, how do we work through these issues and really kind of develop understanding and mutual respect but then at the end, we also need better decision-making process. What I don't like about this graphic is that the convergent thinking comes to a single point, right? A lot of people that do this work focus on consensus. Consensus is a very scary word for me, right? I rarely go for consensus in my process, because if you're dealing for a wicked problem, you're not looking for consensus, right? So the decision point can look in very different ways, right? Because some actors might do this, and some actors might do this, or at some points you might have to vote, right? Maybe it is majority wins in some senses, right? But if you've done a good process, there's a legitimacy to it, right? There's a good example to think about. Right now, most of our democratic processes, push it through, 51% you win, right? But you've won, maybe you pass that law, say Obamacare, right? But if 49% of the people are dedicated to making that work, right? If they believe the process was not legitimate, right? And their voices weren't heard, and the people who won because of manipulation or whatever, right? Then they're going to do everything they can to overturn that as soon as possible. In Colorado, we've passed marijuana, then undone marijuana, then passed all this kind of stuff. Because after every election, whoever loses dedicates themselves to changing the law as soon as possible, right? That's because the processes are not seen as legitimate. Right? We did a process with the school district about grade configuration. I won't get into the details, right? But it was a split vote, right? Very, very, both sides were kind of very strong. One of the school board members was completely against the change, right? They voted, I think it was 4-3 or 5-2 for the change. He was the first one to speak, and he said, I don't think this was a good idea, but now that we've passed it, my job is to work as hard as I can to make sure it works. And it was so refreshing, it was so fascinating. Then I thought about it, it should be that way, right? We've gone through a process, we've seen the different sides, and then we've made a decision, then everyone should say, okay, now let's make this work, right? But it was amazing to me how rare that was, right? That the losing side said, okay, I don't think that's right, but okay, let's do it. Let's figure it out, right? mean, what would have happened if after we passed Obamacare, all the Republicans said, ooh, I think it's a bad idea, but okay, let's figure it out. Let's just make this work. We have the perfect option. And that happens on both sides of the aisle, right? When you have an adversarial thing, right? So a lot of this is how do we, if you do a good job of this and do a good job of this, then hopefully there's more legitimacy to this. That even the losing side says, ooh, I don't think that was right, but I see that I was heard, they respect my opinion, I heard them, so I know why they're doing that, and I can see that I think they made the wrong decision, but let's kind of try to make it work, right? And that's what we've lost in so much of our public policy, right? Because we're such an adversarial process, such a kind of fight for that 51%. And the more you look at policy, there's so much of a focus, especially in the United States, on the election and the vote, right? The implementation is where everything is, right? And if the process to the vote is what's corrupt in some ways, the implementation is always not going to work. And that's that adaptive change, right? If the people that actually have to change didn't believe in the process, right? And in Colorado, we're struggling because the state legislature is passing all these education bills, but the school districts really weren't involved in them, right? So they're passing the bill, they're telling the school district what to do, but the school district has no ownership of that, right? So there's this struggle now between the teachers and administration and the state legislature, right? And the teachers and administration don't believe the process were legitimate, so they're not really paying that much attention, right? And it's just not a way to affect change in a sense. Almost there. So democratic governance I talked about is that notion that change kind of happens at multiple levels. Almost all of our processes, the back end of the process is, okay, now that we've had this conversation, what can individuals do? Or what can kind of networks do? And what can kind of key organizations and nonprofits and businesses do? And what's the relationships between these organizations? And then, yes, maybe kind of laws, right? But it's all of the above. Whereas most public conversations just talking about the law or just talking about the individual, right? If we're dealing with poverty, well, people need to change how they're acting, or we need to change laws to help them, right? Well, we don't talk about this broad range. But the deliberative frame kind of really helps you have a much broader range in that. I'm going to cover this, and we'll do a break and kind of last couple of things before we do the example. One of the aspects as we started doing this work, there is a lot of theoretical kind of pushback on deliberation, right? Particularly kind of from the political left in a sense, of saying making decisions based on talk are going to kind of are going to too much support the status quo and kind of dominant voices and those type of things, right? And if you're saying we need this reasonable conversation and talking to each other, then you're kind of closing out certain types of talk, right? Of anger and really need to change things and those type of things. So there's been a lot of negotiation from the initial kind of theories that were developed with it. So I developed this phrase, passion and partiality, probably about 10 years ago, right? And it's purposely an oxymoron, right? But it's kind of struggling with that notion of impartiality. Some people use neutral. Neutral always seemed to be such a devoid term, right? So I kind of picked impartiality. But I also recognize, and hopefully you recognize this today, that I'm pretty passionate about my work. I'm passionate about my community. I'm passionate about making change. I'm passionate about improving things. I'm passionate about democracy. But since I'm passionate about democracy, I'm passionate about inclusivity and equality, right? So while I'm impartial on the subject, I'm not pushing people to any specific solution to the subject. I am passionate about certain things. I am partisan towards inclusivity and equality. I'm passionate toward democracy, which means people have a say in the rules that govern them, right? Which means I'm passionate about getting voices heard that aren't normally heard. So passion and partiality is this notion that, we're going to be impartial about the content, but we're going to be very passionate about the process. Right? And this is what justifies what we'll do this afternoon in terms of, I train my students to be pretty active facilitators. Right? Being an active facilitator and being an impartial facilitator are two different things. It's easy to be impartial, don't say much, right? But every time my students intervene in the conversation, they're intervening. They're being less impartial in a way, right? So we recognize that we're going to be constantly kind of negotiating that. So this notion, there's a tension between being impartial and honoring equality inclusion. Desmond Tutu has a quote, like, impartiality in the face of oppression serves the oppressor, right? And that's been sent to me over the years by people who are brought up in things, and I agree with that, right? So if I'm running a forum and one person's dominating and not letting other people speaking, if I'm impartial to that, I'm helping that person dominate, right? So I'm going to train my facilitators. No, I want you to make room for the weaker voices or the people that aren't feel comfortable speaking and those type of things, right? But we recognize when they do that, we're violating impartiality in some ways, right? Well, but the same thing, and this is kind of where we ran this process on the river stuff, and we recognize that lots of people, some of the people came in with talking points from one of the local organizations. That was bad information. It was framed very manipulatively, right? And we were kind of, they were talking those arguments, and we were writing them down and passing them on. And we recognized, if we're going to be passionate about process and passionate about good decision making, we have to be passionate about good data, while also recognizing the line between good data and bad data is a tough line sometimes, right? That we can't be experts in all these topics, right? But it's the same thing that if one person has really good information and someone else is making stuff up, and I'm impartial to that, right, and I'm kind of helping the person making stuff up, right? So this becomes a constant tension in our work, both before meetings, during meetings, and after meetings, is negotiating this, right? That we know we need to be impartial. For us to change the conversation, we need to be a trusted source. There's a lot of work to do to get away from the adversarial kind of stuff, right? But then also recognizing that we need to honor these two things, right? And then there's a tension sometimes between this, right? In some ways. Reactions to that, I don't know if thoughts are still developing some of the stuff. We have a couple articles if you're interested in it. But that, trying to negotiate that notion of we're going to be neutral, right? But we also want to make an impact, right? Or it even goes back to we expect people to change their opinion from the beginning to the end of the process because they're being exposed to different ideas and they're being exposed to good information, right? But we're impartial, but we're assuming people are going to change their mind is an interesting kind of oxymoron anyway, right? The exciting thing is there's more and more kind of recognition of this passion and partiality. United Way nationwide or internationally is kind of changed in the way they realize now that they have to kind of be this resource for better conversations in a way. I'm not sure. You've done some stuff with the United Way here, right? But there's lots of organizations that are kind of coming up that are recognizing the need to change the conversation and kind of negotiate this, but we can't be purely neutral in a way, and we're going to be engaged. But how much can you really rely on that process versus content? It's an interesting negotiation. Yeah, I think I finished it because I've already talked about these, so just kind of review. So within the deliberative perspective, the role of the citizens, government, experts, and the media kind of change, right? The citizens become problem solvers versus just voters or advocates in a way. Right? That's the skill set, and this is where the fit for classroom is you're teaching kids how to be collaborative problem solvers, how to see things from the different sides. I push, particularly in our major, I really try to push the communication majors that don't be in this major just to become a better communicator. Right? I don't want my students just to be good communicators in a bad communication environment. Right? I want to teach my kids how to change the environment. Right? I want a communication major in particular to take responsibility for the quality of the communication around them. Right? And obviously I train students as facilitators. Some of them will become professional facilitators. Most of them won't. But what I hear back from my students all the time is how often they use their facilitation skills in everyday, how often they're in a group, and maybe that group's biased towards their opinion, right? But they recognize that they're not seeing the other side, right? That they're having a bad conversation, and all of a sudden they play devil's advocate against themselves, right? Or they take over a meeting that they're not running because they realize the quality of the conversation is so bad, right? So this is huge kind of implications for skill sets for students to really think kind of in these ways, right? The role of government changes from being a primary problem solver to kind of being a key convener, right? And this recognition that government is a key tool, but not the only tool. And that's part of that shift in that conversation that really makes it easy to get away from the adversarial when you rethink the role of government. The role of experts change. Again, experts, instead of kind of being the decision makers, become kind of the helpers in a way, like the partners. Providing. And a lot of what happens with that cycle is key fact questions will come up in the discussion. So after we have an event, we check in with experts, and experts can kind of tell us, yeah, this is what they're getting it wrong, this is impractical, this is, so then that part of that cycle becomes improving the conversation and kind of finding where experts can kind of come in to change the conversation. The role of media, this is the hardest one because media loves conflict, right? Media comes to our events and then they'll find the one example of people, being mean to each other. Whereas most of the event was all about collaboration, and they'll, or they don't come because there's no firework in a sense. But media can play a really important role of helping us think this way, right? Yeah. We've talked a lot about these last two. I'll talk about them. We'll take a break. So faith in human nature and wisdom of crowds are both key aspects underlying the deliberative perspective, but they're both about potential versus reality. Right? I've talked a lot about flaws in human nature, right? But the flip side is it's clear that we can learn and build up a habit of this. Right? If you're going to be democratic, you inherently have to have faith in human nature. Right? When I started the CPD 12 years ago, I had a faith in human nature. I kind of assumed most people are reasonable. right? If you give them a good situation, good information, most people can have this conversation, right? I had enough faith in that to start my organization, right? I can happily tell you, after 11 years of doing this, that faith has actually been fulfilled more than I thought. I thought I was going to deal with a lot of crazies, right? I thought I was going to deal with a lot of people that are going to push back. Very rare. Most of our events are 100 people in the room. My students are out on the tables. I'm never facilitating at a table because I have to float, right? I have to make sure, I'm doing the timing, I'm doing stuff in the front of the room and things like that. But also, if someone starts yelling at one of my students, I want to run up, right? And 11 years of doing this work, I've had to walk up to help a student 3 different times, right? Where I felt someone was kind of frustrated to the point that my student couldn't handle it, right? When I started it, I didn't think I thought there'd be a limited range of topics we could deal with an 18-year-old student kind of running the conversation. As we've gone on, we've taken tougher and tougher topics because they can handle it. Right? I don't know if the crazies don't show up. I don't know if they show up and then they decide not to be that crazy there because it doesn't make sense. Now, I don't handle a microphone in front of 100 people, right? So they're just in front of 8. I don't know if they show up and we transform them, right? That their eyes are open. I don't know what it is, right? But it's amazing how we've had real conversations about tough issues, and we've run into very few problems over the years, right? And I think it's because people are starving for better conversation, right? And yeah.
Are you talking about the student at the university or just the general?
And most of all our things are off campus.
Oh.
So I work a lot more with the community. We do some things on campus. So we don't expect the community to come to campus because they're kind of scared of campus, right? So we do things at the Hilton, and we do things at schools, and we do things at city government offices and that kind of stuff.
And how do who are the people who go, even though they are in community members? No. Are they chosen? It's just
yeah, we'll talk about that with convening a little bit more tomorrow, but it runs the gamut. So most of our events are open to the public, and we'll have some sort of process to kind of get people there. Normally with our partners. So almost every single event we have several partner community nonprofits and that kind of stuff. So a lot of times they're responsible for kind of getting people there. Sometimes we're responsible. Some processes are a little bit more stakeholder, like invited, like we need this a representative from different organizations there. So there's a lot of different ways of thinking about audience development in the field. Sometimes we've done some processes which are much more scientific, that there's a random sample, so we have 2,000 people that complete a survey, and then we get 100 of them to show up, and we're paying them a stipend, but that costs a lot of money, right? So we don't tend to do that unless we're getting some kind of grant to kind of do that. So there's a lot of ways of thinking about who the audience is. Most of ours is just a public invited audience, though we'll do RSVPs, and then if there's a key, like for the river stuff, we knew we needed environmentalists. We needed some people from the outlying cities that wanted this new reservoir, and then we needed some agriculture, right? So with the RSVPs, we kind of asked them which group they were in, and we weren't getting enough agriculture, so then we kind of pushed harder. We made some phone calls to make sure, so we wanted every table to have at least some representative from each. So there's a lot of different ways of kind of thinking about that. And then last, really quickly, the wisdom of crowds. Again, I teach group communication, look a lot about how typically groups make really bad decisions, right? There's a lot of reasons why. But with good process, groups can be huge, right? So a lot of what deliberative process is how do we get the best of human nature instead of feeding the worst of human nature that we get typically? And then how do we get the best out of crowds versus the worst out of crowds that we get naturally without a facilitator? So finished faith in human nature. So then all of this is based on, again, that notion of interactive communication. To be able to tap into the good parts of human nature and to draw the wisdom of crowds, we need better ways of talking to each other. And like we said before, it's not easy to talk to each other like this, so then having a capacity of having small groups, having a trained facilitator, and this is really what Winning and I's program, by using students, kind of allows that, right? That we can have, because one way to think about it is passion and partiality is a pretty rare resource, right? There's not that many people that are really fired up about not having an opinion, right? And so for communities to do this, for them to kind of find 15 volunteers to be passionate partial facilitators, well, the most passionate people about community typically have a position, right? And they're known for having that position. But I can show up with these students, and students are just this great resource that they want the skills and they're passionate maybe about their community, but for a city issue, they might not have really a direct opinion. There's sometimes that I have a student that's really passionate about something that, I'll tell them, like, if you can't facilitate this, right, then don't, right? You can be participant, take your name tag off, you can be a participant in a way. But for most of these issues, they not play this role, right? So this facilitating interactive communication is kind of the heart of the work. That's why I want you to, flipping through this, we can get into this a lot more next time. But if you turn to kind of page 8, if you printed it out, I guess page 7 starts it. It has these
dialogue and deliberation streams of practice. So there's all these kind of ways of doing this work, all kind of based on interactive communication. Some processes are for exploration, like how do we start really thinking about an issue, or kind of diversion, kind of the divergent thinking kind of side of things. Some are conflict transformation. How do we take a specific issue where there's people that really don't understand each other in conflict and transform that conflict? That field itself, it used to be conflict resolution, and then it changed its term from conflict resolution to conflict management or conflict transformation, right? I think it's based on that with the problems idea. Now, we're not going to resolve these conflicts. Conflict is going to be inherent, right? So it's about how do we deal with the conflict and how do we kind of transform the conflict to be productive conflict, right? And for some people, productive conflict seems like that doesn't make sense, right? But that's really what we're doing. We're going to have conflict. We're going to think differently. The issues inherently have values underlying, and then the people rank those values differently, right? So it's all about how do we kind of productively address that conflict. Some of it's decision making. So a lot of stuff we do for the city or the school board is they have to make a decision. We're trying to give them a better sense of the public voice and also refine that public voice. And then sometimes it's collaborative action. Sometimes it's it's like the stuff that we've been doing with poverty. It's as a community, how do we react to this, right? There's not one decision maker. So the next several pages of this just have lots of different talks through those 4 streams, and then has lots of different examples of processes that kind of work with those streams. The really nice thing about this field, about NCUD, is people share like crazy. If you look at this, and I think we sent you the link, right? So you have the links if you want them. Almost every one of these different ways of doing things, there's a website. Most of those websites, all the information on how to do it. They'll have facilitator guides, 100-page facilitator guides, and training workbooks that people just share, right? And I gave you my 110-page workbook, right? But there's just true believers in this field that want people to talk better, right? So there's not so much of the this is mine, you have to pay for it kind of thing. There's plenty of training programs you can pay for. There's one last thing when you think about interactive communication, we talk about 3 Ds. So debate, dialogue, and deliberation are just 3 interactive technologies essentially. When I started this work, I used to teach debate a lot and got very frustrated with it, so I kind of came up, focus and deliberation as an alternative. But then I was convinced, the more I looked at it, was too often we kind of do debate out too early, right? So good debate can be very useful. The problem is about 95% of the debate you see is bad debate, right? So instead of just kind of getting rid of debate, a lot of the work, so we sponsored some debates, but typically with a pretty strong moderator, right? So it's not just a spectacle. It's not just, oh, look, who gets the nice finger, right? Who makes the other side look bad? But it's really a debate, kind of how do we design this so expert can really have a tough conversation that really helps us understand issues, right? So that's what we'll talk about more of this tomorrow if you want, but the main class I teach for everyone to take, not just my specialized students, is called public argumentation, and it's about a third debate and a third deliberation, and then a third kind of argumentation and kind of fallacies and logic and that kind of stuff. But we really try to teach debate as a useful model. Actually, I think the story of that class is maybe will be helpful to kind of cap off on in a sense. So I used to teach debate. It was a typical class required lots of communication majors. I had 24 students. They formed 6 teams of 4 students each. The very beginning of the semester, they pick a topic. They pick a topic they really care about, and then they have to frame it as a debate, do tons of research, evidence cards, and do a brief. So it's really research, kind of expert-based, right, data. And then they have to frame it as a yes/no question, right? The United States should build a wall or whatever, right? And then they have a 2-on-2 debate, affirmative versus negative, and then they switch sides and have the debate again, right? So by the end of the semester, they've spent all semester long researching this issue and have 2 debates, and they were forced to make the argument for yes and the argument for no. Right? And at the end of the second debate, I always kind of made the second debate a little shorter, so I'd have about 10 minutes in class after the second debate to say, okay, you're no longer affirmative or negative. You're a real person that's researched this issue all year long, right? What's your position? What do you think? What should we do? Right? About 85% of the students, I started keeping statistics the last 3 or 4 times I taught it. What do you think they said? I don't know.
Yeah, completely.
Most of them picked the topic because they were passionate for a yes or a no, right? We have to build a wall, or we have to do that, whatever, right? But forced to research both sides, and forced to really research that. We had high quality, high expectations that they had to have government documents, it wasn't just like Google, Wikipedia, they had to do some real research, right? But forced to do both sides, the whole debate model is kind of based on the data will tell you yes or no, right? But forced to do both, they had really good arguments on both sides in some ways, and then they kind of got stuck. So I realized this whole class is designed, and And what I was really worried about is they spent all semester long studying that issue. At the end, they didn't know. I think they were demotivated, right?
Yes.
I think they're like, why do I bother, right? I'm gonna just go watch TV, right? So I changed. So I started actually, I studied presidential rhetoric. I studied Clinton a lot. Clinton, at the beginning of his second term, did a president's race initiative, right? Some of y'all might have remembered that. That was what, 92, I guess, right? Or 96. Well, with the race initiative, the White House sent out all this material on how to have tough conversations about race. It had all this material about dialogue and deliberation. So I'm this debate teacher teaching this class. All of a sudden, I'm reading this material on dialogue and deliberation. I'm like, this is what we need to be doing, but not debate, right? So then I started transitioning the class. So we still do the debate, right? So we still do a lot of the research because, again, good debate can be useful. Good debate. So part with the debate, part with the research, good information is elevated, bad information is kind of taken out, right? So they realize from the debate, it's really hard in the debate when the other side's there to make a really bad argument because the other side will kind of attack that, right? So the debate kind of works as this crucible to kind of burn off the bad arguments and keep the good arguments. But again, the debate doesn't get us to a yes or a no. The debate helps clarify what's the good information. Then the last third of the class, they do, and I'll talk a lot more about this, how they do this tomorrow if you're interested, is they create a discussion guide, kind of like this discussion guide you're doing here. It's this NIF framework, right? What the NIF framework is here's a broad problem we all agree with. What should we do about this, right? And we all, frame it in a way that most people agree it's a problem. And then you offer at least 3 different approaches to that problem, not solutions. You'll solve these problems. 3 different approaches, right? Each of those approaches is framed within wicked problems. Each of the approaches is not a magic bullet that fixes it, right? Each of the approaches has certain values that it elevates over others, right? And has certain actions and ideas that really kind of help with that aspect, but then also each approach has some trade-offs, right? We're gonna focus on this, but we're gonna have to give up this, right? So then the NIF model, actually let me get it to you here. So the NIF model is kind of set up to, what do I do again? This way. So this is kind of one of the basic tools. This is 2-hour meeting in a sense. Again, framed very simple. Here's a common problem we all agree with. Here's at least 3 different approaches. The actual process itself is you'll spend time after you introduce the model and you kind of let people talk about why they're there and kind of their values. Then you walk through each of the approaches systematically, right? So this is what we'll do here in a second. We're running out of time a little bit, so we'll do it a little shorter, but you'll get a sense of it. But normally you spend about 20 minutes on each approach, really thinking through that. With a facilitator, the facilitator is trying to make sure you think about both sides. What do you like about this approach? What do you not like about it? When do you kind of struggle with this approach? So once you've walked through the 3, then you have another 30 minutes or an hour at the end. Now that we've had this conversation, where do we move forward? And the design of the approaches aren't, at the end you don't vote. You don't say, how many of y'all for approach 1? Raise your hand, because you're not trying to pick which one to do. The design of the approach is to ensure a full conversation, to make sure you see lots of different sides of it, right? Typically going in, you might really like an approach, but the design of the process will help you realize that, that there's some flaws here, right? And you might really not like another approach, but the way it's framed, an outside impartial body is framing the approaches. They're framing kind of as fairly as possible. They're framing for deliberation, framing for people to have a tough conversation. Most of our framing in society is framing for persuasion, right? I'm framing it to get people to think like I want them to think, right? We're framing things because we want them to have a tough conversation, right? So in the back end, the kind of reflections time at the end, after the deliberation is walking through the approaches. Typically it's 3. It's at least 3. Sometimes it's 4 or 5, right? Part of the reason for 3 is you're getting away from the pro-con, right? The way it's framed, it should be that you don't have one approach that's the opposite of another approach, right? Each approach, you're kind of looking at doing the approach and not doing the approach within that approach, right? So each approach should be somewhat distinct. So you'll see a couple different examples. I think we copied in your guide of the pages from my workbook. I think you have some examples. Yeah, here's my little cheat sheet. If you look on page 48, 48 and 49, you have some additional examples. A lot of times these workbooks, NIF creates these workbooks. Public Agenda also does. So there's a lot of workbooks out there. So in terms of class, you can find pre-made material on tons of different issues that you can just use in your class for conversation. What I do in that deliberation class is they have to create one of these, right? So they're assignment for the semester. And the reason why I think the class works so much better now when we pull it off, it's a hard class to pull off. At the end of the semester, instead of them saying, oh, I don't know, right, because of the 2 debates, right? At the end of the semester, they feel they know something, right? Because we didn't ask them to solve the issue, right? We didn't ask them to come up with the best solution to this tough problem, right? We asked them to make sense of the issue and to lay out the options, right? So, and I think this is really the role of the expert in society. Expert can't tell us, you need to do X. The expert can tell us, hey, you can do X, Y, and Z, and here's what happens if you have X, Y, and Z, and here's the trade-offs of it, right? But the decision is the public's decision, right? Because again, there's not a right answer, right? There's better and worse answers depending on what's important to you, right? So now at the end of the semester, the students feel like experts, right? I know about this issue. They might prefer a certain option, right? But again, the role of the expert is not to make the decision. The role of the expert is that these are the choices you have to make, right? And these choices and this information based on good information and research that helps us really understand, right? So that's what these discussion guides. When you look at deliberation broadly, there are several aspects to deliberative practice that helps us have a better conversation. So part of it is good background material, right? That's created by an impartial source that provides a base of information. You know, there's a lot of statistics and things in here, right? And then you have the small groups, so you can actually have interaction. You have a facilitator that can kind of help you have that conversation. We'll get a lot into that this afternoon. You have, at the beginning of the meeting, you talk about the ground rules and goals, right? So at the beginning of my meetings, I talk a little bit about deliberation. I often show the grown zone graphic to the public, and I talk about what we're doing and talk about the need to work through. I talk a little bit about tensions and give a little mini lecture, not a 2-hour one like this morning, but a little 8-minute lecture on kind of wicked problems and how we have to change the way we talk. So we kind of setting an environment. And then the ground rules, I'll show you ground rules later, but talk about how to listen to understand and to kind of respect other perspectives, and, but also to be honest, right? So we're negotiating that. We're negotiating civility. I tend not to use the word civility. It's a very popular word now. Some people don't like civility because civility is used to quiet voices a lot of times, right? Sometimes we need to be angry, right? So there's a negotiation. We want people to be respectful of other opinions, but we also want people to be truthful, right? And we don't want people to hold back in a sense because they think that what they're saying might not be inappropriate, right? So we try to set these ground rules to kind of do that. We have one ground rule that we really like. It's okay to disagree with curiosity and hostility, right? We want people we invite them to disagree. We don't want, if someone else is saying something they disagree with, we want them to say, I think differently than that, right? We want to open up that space, but we also don't want them to attack that person, right? And that's one of the interesting design aspects. By having good background material, which is typically built through public process, right? Like the superintendent example, we had 2,000 surveys. From those 2,000 surveys, we developed background materials that we're reacting to, right? So now, instead of me having to disagree with Ashley to her face, I can disagree with this, right? It allows me, because we don't know how to disagree, right? Some people love disagreeing, right? Some people love conflict, and most people avoid conflict. Very few people are in the middle, which kind of try to make conflict productive, right? So by having background material to react to, it makes it easier for people to have a tough conversation without having to disagree with people at the table. They can disagree with this, right? And it gives you a mechanism to do that. And then obviously the facilitator is making it easier for people to disagree in a productive way by how they ask questions and those type of things. And you'll see, we'll talk about those kind of questions a little bit, right? So that's the kind of basic NIF model. I would probably say a third, maybe a half of our processes kind of use this model in some sense of having different approaches, right? Lots of other models, and again, the NCD resource guide shows, wisdom cafes and citizens juries, and all these different kind of ways of kind of doing this work. But we'll focus today on the NIF model. It's a nice base model, and it's a really good model for classrooms. Political science classrooms, communication classrooms. We go into economics classes and do forums like this. We go into sociology classes. There's books on race issues. There's books on immigration issues. There's so many different topics in here that we serve. One of the other kind of roles that we serve, I don't know how much Wendy does this, is we're kind of the deliberation center on campus, right? Just like there's probably a speaking center, right? That we can kind of help you train students how to give a good speech, or a writing center, help you kind of train your students how to write. That maybe your discipline isn't writing, but you need some help. So the deliberation centers on campus can be, hey, if you want to have an interactive conversation in your class, but you don't know how to do that, right? Sometimes I bring my students to other classes and we split them up and have these conversations. Often using these preset books that already exist online. You've got a couple, Public Agenda and NIF have tons of them. Most of them are free online, or maybe a buck or two to get a PDF, or you can kind of produce your own. So we're going to be doing, in a second here, we're going to jump in and kind of use the Shaping Our Future as an example to kind of, you'll be the participants, I'll be the facilitator, to kind of show you a little bit how one works. And then this afternoon, we'll do another one with just a one-page framing, right? And we normally do the one-page framing. Most of these NIF books, these are short. These are the new ones. This one's 12 pages. They used to be about 30 pages. Again, the 3 approaches. But the last 2 pages would be a summary, just like this one. And the last 2 pages were a summary. We knew people showing up, like for class, we can give them the 30-page one and assign it. They're supposed to read it and come to class. But for the public, we can't, right? Even if we have a 30-page one, who reads it? So most of the time, we would just use these 2 pages at the end. We would call it a placemat. We would photocopy it, one big piece of paper, like 11 by 17, and they would have it in front of them like a placemat. Right? So that's kind of what we'll be doing here is mainly, hopefully you got to read the whole thing, but even if you didn't, just have those last 2 pages in front of you. We'll walk through that, and that becomes just something to react to for the facilitator to kind of use. Right? So some of our events, all we've done is develop a 1-page summary. Here's one thing just to react, to help kind of structure the conversation, to help us have a little deeper conversation.
Martine, do you think we have time to watch the video, or should we get straight to the?
So lunch is getting here at 12:15, right?
Yeah, well, we have it scheduled to eat at 12:30. They said they're gonna be here at 12.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we can split it. We can do part of it and then have lunch and then do the other part. So I got time afterwards. We had to brief the forum. We got quite a bit of time after lunch, so we don't have to finish the forum before lunch. So we can show the way. Because the other thing NIF does is they normally develop little 10-minute videos to introduce the topics. So again, in your classes, and the videos are nice because to introduce a topic, you have to be careful. You want to frame it, fairly to the different sides and things like that. So kind of doing that yourself can be tough. So that allows you a video to kind of frame it in a way that hopefully kind of lays it out. So we'll kind of do that example here in a second. Make sure I talk about these. So yeah, NIF model, typically 2 or 3 hour meetings. It's a medium-sized group. What we normally do is we'll do this, but we'll have 15 tables doing it at the same time. Right? And I'll talk a little about note taking before we go to. Works best with multiple similar meetings or held when you really see how different kind of people react to it. Issues or focus are a common problem in at least 3 approaches. I talked about that. Discussion of the approaches is focused on having participants explore appreciations and concerns with dedicated. So all deliberative practices, you're making choices to structure the conversation in a certain way. We recognize, though, going back to passion and partiality, by us structuring the conversation in a certain way, that's a lot of power, right? There's always been a constant negotiation between letting the people talk about what they want to talk about and us kind of, no, we're going to structure, you're going to react to this data in a sense. Right? So one of the boxes that at least the NIF model in particular uses is we're going to focus on what you like and don't like about these 3 approaches, right? Especially during the heart of the deliberation. Now, when you get to reflections time, you're cutting across the approaches, you're adding new approaches, you're opening it up, right? But again, it's the notion of we don't have enough time to just talk about everything, right? So it is a structured conversation, but we recognize that we're using a lot of power when we structure the conversation that much, right? But you'll see when we do this, especially for the note, if we're doing this for real, we're taking notes. And I think Wendy's going to take notes to kind of show you an example of the type of notes you take with an NIF form really. But I'm going to force the conversation into why do you like this approach and why don't you like the approach. Right? And partly the reason is because that's the data that's most useful. If I have 15 conversations going at the same time, having a list of notes that's primarily organized into these are the reasons they like it, and these are the reasons they don't like it, right? And then you'll have some other stuff or questions that might come up or other concern, So the shorthand that I use and we do a kind of showing is a comment that someone makes in support of it will be a plus, comment against it is a minus, and there's just a bullet point for just a general comment. Right? But you imagine I have 15 conversations for 2 hours. At the end of that, all those students type up their notes and send them to me, and then I have this whole long list. And it's what's important to people. We did this for this grade configuration issue with the school district. We had them all written down. We're using easels, right? So we're taking all the notes on easels so people can kind of see the public notes. Right? At the end, we gave everyone 5 dots, and we said, put the dots next to the arguments that are kind of most resonating with you. Right? So they got up and read through everything and put the dots. So then now we had kind of some quantitative data of the reasons people liked or didn't like each approach, and the weight of those reasons, how strong they were. So when we give our report to the school district, telling the school district, the people that showed up to our meetings who weren't representative, right, who showed up were people who were passionate about the issue, which approach they liked of keeping it the same or changing it in a couple different ways with this issue wasn't as relevant as why they were for or against the change. Right? So what the NIF model did was instead of looking at the policy or what they wanted, it was why did they want it. Right? And that was huge for A, helping them make the decision, because the school district could see what do people care about and why, right? But also, they could, sometimes people cared about things that were wrong, right? They could look at it, okay, they were against this, but the reason they were against it is a reason that's not true, right? Or the evidence doesn't support it, so they can kind of not take that as seriously, right? But even more importantly, it was huge for the implementation of the decision. Once the district decided to change, to do option B essentially, right? They could look at everything that people liked about option A and say, how can we try to do some of that, right? And they could look at all the concerns about option B, right? And say, how do we mitigate that? But that's because the public process that we did forced people into the arguments they were for and against stuff versus just asking them what they were for and against. That makes sense? So that helps us really kind of dig deep. So that's why I'll force y'all into that box sometimes. My follow-up question is like, so from that comment, does that mean you support this, or is that a concern that you have, right? And you'll see it bounce back and forth. And as a facilitator, say if we have 20 minutes per approach, in my head, I want to spend, not 10 minutes on each in a sense, but some nice time on what you like and what you don't like about the approach. So if everyone at the table seems to love it, then I'm going to push people to say, let's talk about this, right? People that don't like this approach, what's important to them, right? If everyone's dumping on it, then I'm going to push, okay, we all don't seem to like it, but does anyone say anything good to say? I'll try to push. And you can't really say, we're going to spend 10 minutes on the good stuff and 10 minutes on the bad stuff, because someone's argument about good might spark someone's argument against that, right? So it's going to be kind of flexible, and it's interaction. And you'll see me facilitate, and then this afternoon I'll talk about all the facilitation tactics I used, right? And then you'll get some time to practice, right? We have food here. Do we want to go a little bit and then? It's not warm or anything, right?
Yeah, why don't we eat and then we'll feel
We can
like,
take a break and then
have
we
some
can
more
do it.
energy.
And most of the time, deliberation, there is food involved, right? Like breaking bread, bizarre events, I have food. So we're here. So finished faith in human nature. So then all of this is based on, again, that notion of interactive communication. To be able to tap into the good parts of human nature and to draw the wisdom of crowds, we need better ways of talking to each other. And like we said before, it's not easy to talk to each other like this, so then having the capacity of having small groups, having a trained facilitator, and this is really what Winnie and I's program, by using students, kind of allows that, right? That we can have. Because one way to think about it is passion and partiality is a pretty rare resource, right? There's not that many people that are really fired up about not having an opinion, right? And so for communities to do this, for them to kind of find 15 volunteers to be passionate and partial facilitators, well, the most passionate people about community typically have a position, right? And they're known for having that position. But I can show up with these students, and students are just this great resource that they want the skills and they're passionate maybe about their community, but for a city issue, they might not have really a direct opinion. There's sometimes that I have a student that's really passionate about something that, I'll tell them, like, if you can't facilitate this, right, then don't, right? You can be participant, take your name tag off, you can be a participant in a way. But for most of these issues, they don't play this role, right? So this facilitating interactive communication is kind of the heart of the work. That's why I wanted you to, flipping through this, we can get into this a lot more next time, but if you turn to kind of page 8, if you printed it out, or I guess page 7 starts it, it has these dialogue and deliberation streams of practice. So there's all these kind of ways of doing this work, all kind of based on interactive communication. Some processes are for exploration, like how do we start really thinking about an issue, or kind of diversion, kind of the divergent thinking kind of side of things. Some are conflict transformation. How do we take a specific issue where there's people that really don't understand each other in conflict and transform that conflict? That field itself, it used to be conflict resolution, and then it changed its term from conflict resolution to conflict management or conflict transformation, right? And I think it's based on that wicked problems idea. Now, we're not going to resolve these conflicts. Conflict is going to be inherent, right? So it's about how do we deal with the conflict and how do we kind of transform the conflict to be productive conflict, right? And for some people, productive conflict seems like that doesn't make sense, right? But that's really what we're doing. We're going to have conflict. We're going to think differently. The issues inherently have values underlining, and then the people rank those values differently, right? So it's all about how do we kind of productively address that conflict. Some of it's decision making. So a lot of stuff we do for the city or the school board is they have to make a decision. We're trying to give them a better sense of the public voice and also refine that public voice. And then sometimes it's collaborative action. Sometimes it's it's like the stuff that we've been doing with poverty. It's as a community, how do we react to this, right? There's not one decision maker. So the next several pages of this just have lots of different kind of talks through those 4 streams and then has lots of different examples of processes that kind of work with those streams. The really nice thing about this field, about NCDD, is people share like crazy. If you look at this, and I think we sent you the link, right? So you have the links if you want them. Almost every one of these different ways of doing things, there's a website. Most of those websites, all the information on how to do it. You know, they'll have facilitator guides, 100-page facilitator guides, training workbooks that people just share, right? And I gave you my 110-page workbook, right? But you know, there's just true believers in this field that want people to talk better, right? So there's not so much of the, you know, this is mine, you have to pay for it kind of thing. There's plenty of training programs you can pay for. There's one just last thing when you think about interactive communication, the 3 Ds. So debate, dialogue, and deliberation are just 3 interactive technologies essentially. When I started this work, I used to teach debate a lot and got very frustrated with it. So I kind of came up, you know, focus and deliberation as an alternative. But then I was convinced, the more I looked at it, was too often we kind of threw debate out too early, right? So good debate can be very useful. The problem is about 95% of the debate you see is bad debate, right? So instead of just kind of getting rid of debate, a lot of the work, you know, so we sponsored some debates, but typically with a pretty strong moderator, right? So it's not just a spectacle. It's not just, oh, look, you know, who gets the nice zinger, right? Who makes the other side look bad? But it's really a debate, kind of how do we design this so expert can really have a tough conversation that really helps us understand issues, right? So that's what we'll talk about more of this tomorrow if you want, but the main class I teach for everyone to take, not just my specialized students, is called public argumentation, and it's about a third debate and a third deliberation, and then a third kind of argumentation and kind of fallacies and logic and that kind of stuff. But we really try to teach debate as a useful model. Right? Actually, I think the story of that class is maybe be helpful to kind of cap off on in a sense. So I used to teach debate. It's a typical class required lots of communication majors. I had 24 students. They formed 6 teams of 4 students each. The very beginning of the semester, they pick a topic. Right? They pick a topic they really care about, and then they have to frame it as a debate, do tons of research, evidence cards, and do a brief. So it's really research, kind of expert-based, right, data. And then they have to frame it as a yes/no question, right? You know, the United States should build a wall or whatever, right? And then they have a 2-on-2 debate, affirmative versus negative, and then they switch sides and have the debate again, right? So by the end of the semester, they've spent all semester long researching this issue and have 2 debates, and they were forced to make the argument for yes and the argument for no. Right? And at the end of the second debate, I always kind of made the second debate a little shorter, so I'd have about 10 minutes in class after the second debate to say, okay, you're no longer affirmative or negative. You're a real person that's researched this issue all year long, right? What's your position? What do you think? What should we do, right? About 85% of the students, I started keeping statistics the last 3 or 4 times I taught it. What do you think they said? I don't know.
Yeah, completely.
Most of them picked the topic because they were passionate for a yes or a no, right? We have to build a wall, or we have to do that, whatever, right? But forced to research both sides, and forced to really research that. We had high quality, you know, high expectations. They had to have government documents, you know, it wasn't just like Google, Wikipedia, you know. They had to do some real research, right? But forced to do both sides. The whole debate model is kind of based on the data will tell you yes or no, right? But forced to do both, they had really good arguments on both sides in some ways, and then they kind of got stuck.
Yep.
So I realized this whole class is designed, you know, and what I was really worried about is they spent all semester long studying that issue. At the end, they didn't know. I think they were demotivated, right?
Yes.
I think they're like, why do I bother, right? I'm going to just go watch TV, right? So I changed. So I started actually, you know, I studied presidential rhetoric. I studied Clinton a lot. Clinton, at the beginning of his second term, did a president's race initiative, right? Some of y'all might have remembered that. That was, what, 92, I guess, right? Or 96. Well, with the race initiative, the White House sent out all this material on how to have tough conversations about race. It had all this material about dialogue and deliberation. So I'm this debate teacher teaching this class. All of a sudden, I'm reading this material on dialogue and deliberation. I'm like, this is what we need to be doing, but not debate, right? So then I started transitioning the class. So we still do the debate, right? So we still do a lot of the research because, again, good debate can be useful. Good debate. So part with the debate, part with the research, good information is elevated, bad information is kind of taken out, right? So they realize from the debate, it's really hard in the debate when the other side's there to make a really bad argument because the other side will kind of attack that, right? So the debate kind of works as this crucible to kind of burn off the bad arguments and keep the good arguments. But again, the debate doesn't get us to a yes or a no. The debate helps clarify what's the good information. Then the last third of the class, they do, and I'll talk a lot more about this, how they do this tomorrow if you're interested, is they created a discussion guide, kind of like this discussion guide you're doing here. It's this NIF framework, right? What the NIF framework is here's a broad problem we all agree with. What should we do about this, right? And we all, frame it in a way that most people agree it's a problem. And then you offer at least 3 different approaches to that problem, not solutions. You'll solve these problems. 3 different approaches, right? Each of those approaches is framed within wicked problems. Each of the approaches is not a magic bullet that fixes it, right? Each of the approaches has certain values that it elevates over others, right? And has certain actions and ideas that really kind of help with that aspect, but then also each approach has some trade-offs, right? We're gonna focus on this, but we're gonna have to give up this, right?